Good morning. Hello there. Today we're going to talk about nonfiction notice and note strategies, contrasts and contradictions. So if you don't complete the digital notebook today, it is homework. So write that down, pause the video, write that down, complete the digital notebook if not done in class, and then come back to me when you're all set. Okay, so just like we did for literary, there are also nonfiction signposts. So we're going to start today by learning about contrast and contradictions. Should sound familiar because we talked about those in with literary text as well. So let's figure out what those are in nonfiction texts.
Hi, today we're going to be talking about nonfiction signposts. These are signposts when you're reading nonfiction text that will help you to become a closer reader. The first signpost is contrast and contradiction. A contrast and contradiction is when things, people, or ideas contrast or contradict each other. When you notice a contrast and contradiction, it is important that you stop and ask yourself the anchor question. What is the difference, and why does it matter? Some contrast and contradiction clue words that you can spot when you're reading are however, yet, but, unlike, or different. Let's look at this example. Even though the temperature dipped below 32 degrees, the water did not freeze. When I see this, I'm wondering why the water didn't freeze if it's 32 degrees. I would expect water to freeze at 32 degrees. So why does that matter? Well, perhaps there's something in the water that's keeping it from freezing. We probably need to keep reading to find out. So, in review, a contrast and contradiction is when you're reading and you notice something that is a little bit different than what you would expect. And don't forget to ask yourself the anchor question. What is this difference, and why does it matter?
Created using Okay, so pretty similar to the fiction signpost too. So in literary texts, we tell you to look for places in which the character acts in a way that is different from previous actions, right? We also tell you to look for places in which the character acts in a way you wouldn't act. Similarly, we want you as readers to look for two types of contrasts and contradictions in nonfiction texts: those that are discussed in the text and those that arise as the reader thinks about how his or her life or knowledge contrasts with what's described in the text. So as you're reading, keep the questions, what surprised me, in mind. This will help you to see more contrasts and contradictions than if you read without that purpose. So let's look at how contrasts or contradictions can show up in printed text. Sometimes it's very obvious, but sometimes it's not. So think about what's the difference and why does it matter? Okay. And then what surprised you? So Sparta, let's try to find the contrast and contradiction here. Sparta was content to keep to itself and provided an army assistance when necessary. Athens, on the other hand, wanted to control more and more of the land around them. The author's signal word here, on the other hand, shows you how Athens differed from Sparta. So in this case, it was pretty obvious, right? Let's try another one. Even though the temperature dipped below 32 degrees, the water did not freeze. Here we're tipped off by the phrase, even though. We realize that something we expect to happen isn't going to happen. We know that water freezes below 32 degrees, but the phrase has let us know that something unusual is going to happen. So we're prepared for the contradiction when the sentence tells us that the water didn't freeze. Authors often use signal words to help us notice contrasts and contradictions. When we notice contrasts like the one between Sparta and Athens, or contradictions like water that's colder than 32 degrees not freezing, we should ask ourselves, what is the contrast or contradiction and why does it matter? In this case, it matters that we understand what had happened to keep the water from freezing, and that seems very strange. So look for words like alternatively, nevertheless, Nevertheless, by contrast, however, otherwise, then again, unlike, on the other hand, yet, different from, still, instead, although. Okay. So let's practice here. We're going to read through this story called Garana's Story, A Day in the Life of a Young Afghan Refugee. And let's look for contrast and contradictions. Keep those contrast and contradiction words in mind as we read. So the sun is not yet risen over the rocky hills outside the city of Peshawar in Pakistan. Loudspeakers from the top of a mosque or Muslim house of worship call out to the people, God is great. It is better to pray than to sleep. Come to prayers. 10-year-old Garana rises from a mat on the dirt floor of her family's house. She puts on her black robe and covers her head with an old shawl. Then she walks to the mosque to pray. Garana and her family have lived in their one-room house for 2 years. It's one of thousands of mud brick homes in Shamshatu Afghan refugee camp. The camp holds about 50,000 Afghan refugees. They are people who have fled from war or drought in Afghanistan. Garana works hard. Her father left the family several years ago. Her mother can't see very well and can do little to help. Her older brother works all day weaving carpets, and her younger brother is too small to do many chores. So Garana does most of the household tasks, but her day is not all work. She has time for school, friends, and even a little mischief. So I'm finding here, this is a contradiction for me, because I usually hear loudspeakers at like games, right? Like football games or soccer games. They're not used to wake me up. And another contradiction that I'm thinking of is their style of government. They don't have like a separation of church and state like we do. So the contrast and contradiction I noticed, another one is Garana is 10 and she woke up and she put on a robe and walked by herself to the mosque. And why does this matter? In this country, not too many people would send a 10-year-old out walking alone in a city when it's dark. So that seems really different from my own experience. Let's read some more. Early morning. After prayers, Garana begins her morning chores. She walks to the camp's water pump to fill 2 bottles. After bringing them home, she eats breakfast, which is usually hot tea and bread. Then she washes the dishes in the backyard using cold pump water. Next, she sweeps the floor of the one-room house. Then it's time to walk to the bakery. There she leaves a small amount of flour. The bakers will use it to make a loaf of bread. Garana's family will eat that loaf for their next 3 meals. Now it's time to walk to school. Class time. Children in the refugee camp go to school 6 days a week. Boys and girls attend separate classes. Garana is in first grade, although she is 10 years old. Notice any keywords? That's because when she lived in Afghanistan, Garana and other girls were not allowed to go to school. She has a lot of catching up to do. Classes in Garana's school go only through the 2nd grade for girls and the 3rd grade for boys. Still, it's an important start. Garana gets to school just before classes begin at 8:30. The concrete building has 6 classrooms. These rooms have no windows, but there is paint on the walls. 35 girls are in Garana's class. The students sit on mats on the floor. They study mathematics, the Afghan languages of Pashto and Dari, and the English alphabet. There is also class time for signing and drawing. Singing? Did I spell it wrong? Maybe. Garana enjoys school. My favorite subject is English, she says. If you can speak languages, then you can understand what people are saying. It's easier to get things done. Today, Garana stands at the chalkboard with a ruler and leads the class through the English alphabet. She mixes up B and D. Otherwise, she recites the alphabet perfectly. All right, what contrast and contradictions are we noticing? So one thing that I noticed, hopefully you did too, it says Garana is in first grade, although, did you pick up on that word? She is 10 years old. That's because when she lived in Afghanistan, Garana and other girls were not allowed to go to school. So think about, why does it matter? Why did the author tell you this information? Why is it important? What do you think? Hmm. So stop, pause for a minute, go to slide 6 on your digital notebook and fill that in. Why did the author tell you this information? Why is it important? Or just think, why is it important that we know this? Okay. Lunch break. I think it's important that we know this because it gives us background information about Guarana, right? Like it gives us information about her culture as well, and it also gives us information about why she and her family left their home and why they're in this place, right? And how it wasn't there wasn't equality there. All right, let's keep reading and think more about contrasts and contradictions. Lunch break. Classes end before lunch. The students race out to the small dirt playground to play on the swings, the slide, and the merry-go-round. Garana usually visits with her friends, but soon it's time for more chores. She heads to the bakery to pick up the bread. Then she walks along the mud streets to her house. After a quick hello to her mother, Garana goes to the pump to collect water. When she returns, she fills the teapot and puts it on the small fire. Garana sits on her mat on the floor and eats her lunch with her hands. Today, her mother has prepared potatoes along with the bread and tea. Some days we have potatoes, some days we have rice, and some days we have beans, Garana says. Whatever we eat for lunch, we have again for dinner. Rice is my favorite food. Are you noticing any contrasts and contradictions to what you know? Afternoon and evening. After lunch, Garana trudges back to the pump for water to wash the plates and cups. Then she sweeps the house, cleans the yard, and feeds her family's 4 chickens. Once in a while, when there is money, she goes to the local shop to buy food. After she finishes her chores, she does her homework. Soon it's time for dinner. Because the houses in the refugee camp have no electricity, the family eats the evening meal before it gets dark. Then, if there is any daylight left, Garana plays with her best friend, Asia. Sometimes they get into a little trouble. Garana saw some of the other girls with jewelry in their noses, Asia explains. She said that looks beautiful. She asked me to pierce her nose, so I took a long sewing needle and I did it. Garana's mother was not pleased, but she helped Garana put a string through the hole to keep it open. Garana hopes that someday she can replace the string with jewelry. Are you noticing any contrasts and contradictions here? Think about things, that are different from what you know. Let's keep reading. A wish for peace. Karana has a hard life in the refugee camp, but at least there is no fighting. I would like to go back to Afghanistan, she says, but not until there is peace everywhere. We are told at school that some parts of Afghanistan are safe, but there is still fighting in other parts. Many others share Garana's wish. For more than 20 years, the nation has suffered from war and unrest. Now, the Afghan people, with the help of countries around the world, are trying to make changes. They hope to bring peace to Afghanistan. All right. So, let's think about the contrast and contradiction that I noticed was sometimes think about what contrast and contradiction did you notice? Like sometimes I notice that they're present when we read a text and compare that to our own experiences, right? So what I noticed is that she does chores after school, she eats with her hands, lunch and dinner are the same. She has no electricity. She lives in a place where there's war and little peace. And then when we think about why it matters, we'll start to develop an understanding about author's purpose and determine the main idea. So think about why it's important. So my thoughts about why it's important is Garana and her family have a difficult situation, right? And she needs to contribute to her family's well-being. So that's maybe why, her life is so different from ours. Like she needs to kind of take up some of that responsibility that as a child that her parents can't. All right. So now you're going to try it. So you're going to read in your digital notebook the hard at work text that's there, and you're going to look for contrasts and contradictions. Look for those key words, right, as you read, and ask yourself, why does this matter? So there are audio buttons if you would like. It's a shorter text, so read through it, right? And then jot down the contrasts and contradictions you noticed, and then jot down why it matters. Turn in your digital notebook when you finish.